Welcome, everyone, to the 9th episode of POCUS Journal podcast. I'm really excited. Today we have Brandon Otto, who's here with us to discuss an article from the April issue of POCUS Journal. This can be found at POCUSjournal.com with all other issues of POCUS Journal. Its article is a consensus. It starts on page 95 in the April 2024 issue of POCUS Journal, Volume 9, Issue 1. And we have the first author here, Brandon Otto, with us to discuss a lot of things, including the document that was published. So, Brandon, tell us about yourself and take it away.
Sure. Well, I am Brandon Otto. I'm a critical care PA, currently out in Connecticut in the medical ICU in the Yale system, but I've worked in a variety of other critical care settings. But I've been doing this for some years, and for most of that time, I've been doing ultrasound as well. I trained in a critical care residency out at Hopkins, and then I was in the Maryland system, and I was at UConn around here, and now at Bridgeport Hospital. So kind of here and there and everywhere, but we kind of got started on this process a couple of years ago, looking to find some agreement on how we should be doing ultrasound, and we're able to put together a little bit of consensus on that.
Awesome. Brandon, we're so lucky to have you here talking to us today about the article and about you. I always start out asking our guests about some of their POCUS background, how they fell in love with POCUS. Usually there's a first kiss. Do you remember a case or just an example, something that comes to mind of how Point of Care Ultrasound really, you first fell in love with it, how it changed your practice or really struck you up front?
Yeah, I've been doing it since I first started doing this, and I've certainly had the usual spectrum of cases, from the great glaring ones that you could tell people about when you found a tamponade or a clot in transit or something like that. But to me, it's such an everyday part of my practice that it's almost hard to I almost view it like pulse oximetry or the physical exam. It's people will say, like, gosh, I mean, you put that thing on practically everyone, and in a way it's almost my way of not having to be too clever, because there's so many things that you find that otherwise you would have to be really smart to diagnose in some other way. It just it's part of critical care to me, and it dovetails so well with the kind of granular physiology that we manipulate here, and kind of gives us data that you otherwise wouldn't have. That I would be naked without it, and I think a lot of people rely on it in similar ways.
I love that answer. That's really great. We're only recording audio today, so you can keep your clothes on for sure. Let me ask you a little bit about this organization that SPOCUS. It's called SPOCUS, Society of POCUS. Some of our listeners may have heard of it, seen it on Twitter. Tell us a little bit more about that and how you got involved with that organization and what their role was in sort of the group that formed this consensus document.
Yeah, I don't want to speak outside of my own authority. I'm a member of SPOCUS, but not part of their leadership. But Society of Point of Care Ultrasound is a society that is multidisciplinary, and it is kind of focused on representing point of care ultrasound as exactly what it sounds like, as a tool that a lot of people are using. It historically has its roots in some kind of non-physician users, particularly in the PA world. So they're still, I think, represented most strongly there. For instance, they do a mini conference most every year alongside the AAPA conference, iScan, which is, if you know sauna games, kind of a similar idea. They usually get PA students who are interested, and they come out and kind of compete, things like that. But it's just kind of what it sounds like. And what I like is that it focuses on POCUS, kind of qua POCUS. And I think that the world could use something like that, because so much what you hear about POCUS is in other contexts. So, I was kind of conversing with some of their leadership a couple of years ago, and we started talking about this subject, and that's how we got down this path of them kind of recommending or requesting that we start putting together some kind of a consensus statement on some questions of kind of how we ought to be doing POCUS from that multidisciplinary lens. Not for an intensivist or for an emergency physician, but for everyone.
Excellent. And Brandon, this mission that you're talking about, interdisciplinary collaboration, the universal POCUS experience, that's really at the heart of POCUS Journal. So our ethos is aligned there. I think the listeners should check out spocus.org, the website for SPOCUS. They have the links there. It looks like the conference at iScan you talked about already happened this year, but
Just recently, yeah. I think they had 50 teams or something. There's a ton of PA students who are really interested in ultrasound these days, which is awesome. We didn't have anything like that when I was in school.
That's really cool. And it looks like including pre-hospital providers, nurses, advanced practice, folks, lots of, CRNAs, really everything across the spectrum. So that's super cool. So then as far as getting this consensus going, some of the folks that you were able to recruit as part of this effort, these are some heavy hitters. We got, members of the POCUS Journal editorial board, Cameron Baston, we got, Ria Dancel, Abhilash Koratala. Those are, Twitter famous POCUS enthusiasts who we're fortunate to have on our board as well. How did they get looped in?
We reached out to them. When we were putting together the group, we put a little working group together to kind of draft some of the concepts and put together some initial statements, and then we reached out to a larger expert panel. And the goal for that was to really have good representation from a cross section of ultrasound, really POCUS users, which to me meant both different specialties and backgrounds, ranging from, emergency medicine or critical care, which have always been kind of, strongholds of ultrasound use, but also areas where it's not so well established, internal medicine, family medicine, all the various specialties, and including people who work in primarily other settings. So we really wanted to hear from people who were using ultrasound, in the clinic or on the hospital floors, or even, pre-hospitally and in other settings. And also, different training backgrounds. So a variety of physicians and also some non-physicians and so on. So really what the kind of model I kept thinking about was, if you're going to, let's say, order a CAT scan, you're going to get a CT of somebody's head. It doesn't really so much matter if you're in the emergency department or on the floor, you're a cardiologist or an internist or something else, or you're in a small hospital or a big hospital, or what state you're in, or probably to some extent what country you're in. It's going to be a pretty similar scan. The certain things you could say about that test, which are just inherent to the thing itself, because that's how you do it safely and appropriately and kind of standard protocols. Or if you give a drug, it doesn't kind of so much matter where you are. And I imagine that you could say some similar things about POCUS. But to do that, you have to get down to that common denominator. So not just what can you say about how I use it in the ICU as a PA, but what can you say about it for anyone who uses it anywhere? Obviously, you probably can't say as much because some things are specific to the person doing it or the setting or the specialty. But some things, at least we imagined, that you can. And that kind of boils it down to what are the intrinsic characteristics of this thing. But to say that, you have to get good representation, because it's easy for a small number of people to agree on things which only apply to them. And that's what we didn't want to do. And I feel like some of the statements and guidelines out there, that might be the case. They're really for a special setting, or really for a resource setting. It's easy to say that everyone should do certain things that are only possible when you have a lot of resources to do that. Larger centers, more academic centers, for instance. But if that's not possible in a small center, what are you saying? That they shouldn't do ultrasound?
Right. Wow. That is such an articulate answer. I'm gonna have to go back and listen to the podcast to process some of the ideas that you've so articulately, put together. I completely agree with you. I think that that the analogy to the CAT scan is a really good one. And I was thinking as you were talking, that a group of neurologists might have, something very specific to say about indications or interpretation, and whereas the more general use of non-contrast CAT scans across the spectrum, is probably variable. But along those lines, then tell me, the best practice idea, for this consensus, came out of a need you saw to, really bring multidisciplinary providers together around these statements, or what was the gap that this was trying to fill for you, to do this work, because it's a lot of work to do this kind of project.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, if if we could get together, review the literature, and say that it's very clear you should do A, B, and C when you do ultrasound, then that would be straightforward. But we didn't really imagine that would be possible because a lot of these topic areas, um, we didn't think there would be much evidence, and we did do a literature review, but not even a super structured one because there just wasn't much. And so for some of this, I don't know the evidence is possible because it really comes down to just how we would like ourselves and our colleagues to be using this tool so that it is safe and ethical, so that we can interact with them effectively. For example, if somebody else does an ultrasound study, would we like to be able to review documentation of their findings? Would we like to be able to review the images that they found, and so on? So I mean, obviously that some of this there is data that is pertinent too, as well as other guidelines. But we really thought it would mostly come down to consensus. And if you can get everyone to agree that we'd like people to do this a certain way, then that would be ideal. Which of course weakens its strength somewhat, right? We weren't prepared to say that if you don't do all these things, you're doing it wrong. That really depends on your setting and your specific circumstances. But we thought it would be a good baseline, as kind of a general goal, and especially when so many of these programs are kind of developed in a grassroots way. I would say a lot of ultrasound kind of was built up by users themselves. A lot of training has been informal. A lot of programs kind of just cobbled together, and that's not how a lot of technology or practice originates. And that means there's a lot of practice variation. And I'm not gonna say that's always wrong, but again, some kind of a guiding light for, this is probably in general how you ought to be doing this, we thought would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really does. We'll get into some of the, accepted statements shortly, but I think the range that you achieved here includes very practical concepts like ultrasound maintenance and cleaning, which there's no randomized trial for what to do with a, cracked ultrasound probe. But I think that having a range of accepted statements from practical, pragmatic solutions to more, academic or intellectually rigorous, ideas like around training and credentialing and things like that. So let me ask big picture though, the method of doing this. I think a lot of listeners probably heard of the Delphi method or a modified Delphi method. They may have a sense of what it is. Can you tell us more about that? What you learned in this process about, I know even the first step is just part of it, developing the working group is the initial step. It sounds like from your figure 1 on page 98 of the published article. Tell us a little bit about the Delphi method and how you went about pursuing it.
Sure. Yeah. And obviously, I'm sure a statistician could give a more robust answer, but essentially, it's a somewhat structured process for establishing consensus around certain themes. More structured than just getting a bunch of people in a room and chatting about it, but of course less structured than deriving data from an RCT or something. So you essentially get together an expert panel, which represents the constituency you're trying to represent as much as possible. And we kind of talked about how we did that. You put together a collection of statements that you're going to ask them to evaluate, and you offer it to them for them to vote on. So that's what we did. We started with quite a large pool, almost 100 statements, and they were all things related to ultrasound, related to the kind of questions that we described. There's areas that we think there's a lot of practice variation, where it seems like there's either disagreement or just a kind of a lack of clear guidance. And we offered it to them to vote, and it was a 5-point Likert scale from strongly disagreeing to strongly agreeing with it. And we established a consensus threshold to say that if people, more than 75% of them, agreed or disagreed with the statement, either strongly or not strongly, then that met the criteria for agreement. So they could either agree to accept it or agree to reject it. You could kind of agree either way. But they also had the opportunity to respond qualitatively, to offer feedback. So especially if they didn't like a statement, then we really wanted to see what they had to say about it. But honestly, even if they did and they had feedback, it may have had room for improvement. And there were statements that we reintroduced, even though they technically met the criteria. So for the next,
but in subsequent rounds, you mean you reintroduced a modified version of the question based on what one of the expert panel members replied, saying, I wouldn't do that. I can't answer this question. I need to answer it if you modified it this way, and then you reintroduce it on subsequent rounds. Is that right?
Exactly. So statements that met kind of consensus and didn't seem like we could make them much better, we removed from the
Got it.
pool. But those that didn't, we would modify and offer back to the panel based on the feedback. So if a lot of people said, "Hey, I don't know about this. Can you change this or whatever?" Then we would try to, we could combine statements, modify them. Some of them we just dropped. It didn't seem like people were ever going to agree on it. And so we kind of winnow it down as we went. The first round was kind of exploratory. A lot of things that were started there didn't get much farther. Second round, we tried to get as much consensus as possible. And the third round was kind of a cleanup round to try to get some final points. So there was a lot of evolution, especially after the first round. For instance, we had an entire section of statements that were about trying to define certain types of POCUS studies to say, if you're doing a study for this indication or this general idea, it should probably have these elements, for instance, because it seemed like that might be possible, but it ended up not being possible. People couldn't in any way agree about how to do certain sorts of things, at least within this context, right? That's one of those things that in more specialized, specific contexts, you might be able to say. But for everyone to agree that every time you do this kind of study, you should have certain elements or it's no good, it didn't happen. So that entire
Can you
section
tell
was
us
dropped.
more with if you don't mind, an example of something that wasn't able to, move forward just due to disagreement? Anything more specific?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, within that category, it seemed like you might be able to say if you're doing a POCUS study for cardiac tamponade, it should have certain views, certain measurements, things like that. But people, I mean, while people probably agreed on the general concepts, they couldn't really agree that like you have to have these things, and if you don't, then the study is no good. And I think partly because that felt like a strong statement to make, even from perspectives like a medical legal one. People didn't want to make requirements that strong that were kind of applied to everyone across the board. And again, I think that's, if you're going to be a cardiologist and say that this study has to have certain things or it's not adequate, that's probably more feasible. But these are kind of strong statements. So again, we kind of boil things down to a common denominator. What can you say
Yeah.
that's true for everyone always?
Right. And I think minimum criteria is different than, sort of optimal criteria. Sometimes as a participant, you may not always be clear. I mean, I'm sure your questions that you posed were, made that distinction clear. But I think for something like, can you rule out tamponade or, do you need mitral inflow velocities, with the cardiology section, I'm sure, said that you needed that for both, ruling it out or ruling it in, but maybe there were some other members that had other uses of POCUS for say just identifying an effusion, and they always get a stat limited echo to
Right.
follow.
Or does it depend on the clinical context or other data? It's
Yeah.
I will say that in general, although we obviously found consensus on a lot of points, very few of these had universal agreement. So there is just room for different interpretations on a lot of things, and of course that's just the world we live in. But
Yeah.
it's if you disagree with one of these points, I'm not saying no one disagrees with you.
Yeah, I actually, if I could make a completely uninformed observation around the quality of this consensus, the fact that there isn't 100% consensus across the board to me makes the document, I think, stronger because then I realized that that there's thought put into the answers by the participants. So if you had a document that was people just clicked through the Likert scale fast and everyone agreed and it went through very quickly with one round, I would probably worry that the participants weren't really because they get a lot of these kinds of things by email, that maybe they were just getting through it to finish it quickly and not really putting the work in or thought to disagree.
Yeah. No,
Well,
people were quite
I like
involved.
that.
And now, of course, everything is a compromise. If we did 10 rounds, could we have improved things even further and gotten more consensus? Probably, but
Right. No, well, it's a really great result that you have, and there's so much at POCUSjournal.com. This is starts on page 95 of the April 2024 issue. Take a look, listeners. There's a lot of results here for accepted statements. Before we move on, let me ask who wrote the statements, if you don't mind me asking. Was it you and some colleagues, some of the co-authors? How did you? Because I know the participant.
myself with our 6-person kind of initial working group, we drafted the initial statements and then modified as needed. And that was kind of that group was a microcosm of the overall group. They're the first 6 authors here: myself, Robert Baton, a PA, Leon Chen, an NP, Pooja Dalal from Family Medicine, Aria Dancel from Internal Medicine Pediatrics, Stephen Fox from Critical Care. We have Chuck Lange, who's a EMPA and pre-hospital PA. And then did I forget everyone? I think that's everyone.
I think that's
And
six.
so
Yeah.
yeah. So that kind of gave us the kernel of things. But then, as people give feedback, we modified from there.
Got it. And are they SPOCUS members, or they're
Several of them are. Otherwise, it was people we kind of engaged for this.
awesome. Excellent. So my next question was about some of the well, we talked about some rejected statements. I was curious, when you look back at the document, anything that surprised you around either the degree of agreement, or accepted statements that you thought wouldn't reach agreement, or any of the results that stand out to you?
Yeah, there are certain themes where there was, I guess, stronger agreement than I would have necessarily expected. For example, in general, essentially everyone thought that all POCUS studies should be documented. You should be writing what you found, should be saved in some way in archive so people can see your images. And in general, should at least have the ability to be reviewed by some expert process. And really, the disagreement just came down to how strongly people felt about that. For example, if people weren't doing some of those things, is that like a minimum requirement, and otherwise they shouldn't do ultrasound? And some people were pretty close to saying that, but ultimately, they kind of understood that there could be settings where some of those things might not be possible. You might have to have flexibility. If you're a sole practitioner, if you're and there's no infrastructure, are you willing to take ultrasound out of that person's hand if they can't upload their images to a cloud or something like that? They were not, but they really felt in general that all those things were possible. There was some disagreement on the best ways to be maintaining and cleaning our devices. For example, a lot of people thought it was reasonable to cover your machine with like a cover of some kind, like a shroud or a sheet, if you're having trouble keeping it clean. No one thought that should be mandatory, but a lot of people thought it was a reasonable idea. You shouldn't use probes probably if they're damaged or cracked, because you can't really clean them properly, things like that. You probably shouldn't roll your machine around with a ton of supplies on them, because you probably are not going to clean all those supplies. A lot of things like that sort of seem like common sense. But one of the things that I was very interested by was when we got into some questions of consent and ethics, was that it is a very common practice, at least in my world in the ICU, to do non-invasive POCUS studies, like surface echo, on patients who don't consent for it. They don't, dissent, but, maybe a patient who is sedated or comatose, and you just go in to kind of look at things. And some of those studies are probably not strictly clinically indicated. Sometimes it's more for educational purposes, like for practice, like you're learning, or to demonstrate something if you're a educator. And when we really kind of raised that to the panel, well, everyone agreed that it was, common practice in some settings. It's hard to say that it is ethically acceptable. To say that it's okay to do ultrasound studies on patients who don't consent, when you kind of phrase it like that, it's hard to say that it is okay. So there was not really, we couldn't make a statement that people really agreed with on this. There was some suggestion that maybe this could be revisited in another context, like another panel that maybe involved patient representatives, things like that.
Well, that's a
Again, it's
great
hard to
idea.
say that people shouldn't do that, but
Yeah.
it's hard to say they should.
Yeah, no, I see that. That's table 8, has accepted statements with consent and education. That's on page 102. Yeah, that's a really interesting topic. I think to me that definitely strikes me as one of the benefits of this kind of work for the participants and the readers, that and the listeners of the podcast, that sometimes these processes can raise questions that we wouldn't have thought of, on our own. And I've noticed that actually participating in similar studies, the Delphi method, I'll get questions, and then they're ones I hadn't really thought of, because like you started out saying, Brandon, that a lot of POCUS users and programs developed in isolation, and there's been increasing collaboration, across disciplines, but also, across institutions. But a lot of folks are really N of 1 users starting out, and they don't always grapple with some of these, issues as a matter of policy or practice. They don't have the bandwidth to put together, policies for educational users versus credentialed users. in their institution in different settings. And I think that's a great one you raised around education and consent for education. How to do that, is a verbal consent sufficient? Is implied consent is it part of the general implied consent for treatment? So yeah, these are really good questions that I think even if you don't come to consensus or have 100% consensus on, that they're really, grounds for future, consensus documents or study, really, room to survey that and understand. And I really like what you said about bringing in a patient perspective on that. I think that would be really interesting for the POCUS user, audience to learn what patients or families thought about, what incidental findings and educational users. I think that's really something that we expect in teaching hospitals. If you walked into the room and your grandfather had medical students, listening to his chest, that would be really partly what you expect out of the care. And, as well as I do, that a lot of times we're so grateful to have trainees involved in care because it's a lot of attention that other providers can't spend with grandpa because they're off doing other things. And, but you've, of course, I'm sure, as I have encountered instances where patients or families don't want trainees involved at all, whether that's a procedure or an examination. But yeah, I think that's I don't want to hog the airways on this, but you've given me a lot to think about, Brandon. I was thinking
no, it
about,
really kind of gets at like how we view this technology, right? Like for example, some people will argue, a lot of non-invasive ultrasound is really like the physical exam. So maybe you don't need to kind of formally document it or save things. It's like you went and poked the feet or something. And we looked at that, and people did not accept that. They think all ultrasound studies it's like a CAT scan, and you need to document it, save your images or whatever through the same process. You can't just kind of wave your hands and say it happened, but it happened in a non-formal way. Or, if you're doing studies for learning purposes, which of course is important, should you be documenting and saving those kind of things in the medical chart along with other, formal types of tests? And the panel, by and large, didn't think so. They don't want to see your practice tests alongside all of the clinically indicated things. They think you should save them, but it should be in a separate sort of system that gets it out of the way.
right. That seems to be where the field is going on this. I think back when I started, I think before ghost scanning was even a term, it was, like you said, it was extension of a physical exam, and it wasn't radiology, so documentation storage were not emphasized. But I think the one thing I took away from your consensus around this is that it seems like that, uploading archival and review table 11, there's a lot of really solid agreement, in the 90% range for a lot of those questions about storage. So
yeah. And the group was flexible about how you do a lot of these things. So like, look, if you want to print out pictures of your tests and put them in the chart, you want to send your test to an expert on your phone or whatever, as long as it kind of meets your standards of privacy and all that, you do what you got to do. But anything is better than nothing in general. They kind of didn't although they were flexible, they didn't want to hear too many excuses like, well, it's hard we don't have the money for this, or our system's not set up. They're like, you can probably figure something out, and that's better than not doing anything.
Yeah, awesome. Well, this has been such a wonderful, overview of the work that you did. I'm really impressed by the group that you were able to get together, the dedication to the different rounds, and in pursuit of consensus here. I think just in our time remaining, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about, more about you, Brandon, but also I think physician assistants in the ICU setting have a lot of support, maybe postgraduate and training around point of care ultrasound. But for listeners out there, non-physician users who are in different settings like the medical wards or the outpatient setting, what are some opportunities that they have to get involved in point of care ultrasound, to learn POCUS after school, and or even in school? Is POCUS something that's being taught in PA school? That was a question I had. But what can you tell them as far as their access to training and ongoing support?
Yeah, it's tough. Yeah, I've been, I think, somewhat fortunate in critical care that POCUS has penetrated so well, and that means that there's a a lot of opportunities to learn and practice it, ranging from there's patients to there's machines, and particularly that where there are colleagues and supervisors and mentors who have those skills. And I can imagine trying to learn this in a setting where all those things were not the case. And I think a lot of people are in that situation. Maybe they're on the hospital floors or something, or in a clinic or something, and they're like, man, it would be pretty helpful to have this tool, but I don't really have it, and I don't know how to break into that. It is, I think, more commonly being taught in kind of preclinical training.
Okay.
Like I was saying, there are a lot of PA students who are interested in a lot of programs and introducing it to varying degrees. I think it's been true in some medical schools as well, and so on. But I think very heterogeneously. Some
And not a
places not at
requirement.
all.
Not a requirement in undergraduate PA training to be able to
I
have.
think ranging, there are some programs that are doing it for everyone, at least to some degree, and I can understand why it's hard to say, everyone has to have these skills, because it's kind of a high hurdle. Well, you're not going to graduate them if they can't do an echo or something like that. And yet, it's such a valuable skill that you almost feel like they should be learning that over, their fundoscopy that they're going to forget in a little while. So I think it's kind of an evolving area of how much to do with that. And it's tough, I think, if you're in specialties where there's not as much of this, trying to get the skills. Of course, there are courses you could take, certification programs and things like that. And I think doing some kind of a solid course is a good idea as a foundation. It is probably always going to be the case that a lot of learning is on the job, and ideally you're working with some people who can assist with that. And that's one of the things we kind of try to kind of address in our statement. Like, if you're learning in a more grassroots sort of way, what does that look like? For example, what does credentialing look like? If you can't prove to someone that you've trained in this skill, and how would you even do that? How do they know that you're doing it safely? And we kind of thought every department or system has to figure that out on their own. But I think you always need to have some people you're working with who can be of service to you, even if you have to go out of your way to get access to them. If it's not every person that you work with, because a lot of the learning is ongoing. You're doing studies, you're interpreting them. How can you acquire them better? How can you interpret them more accurately? And of course, integrate them into clinical context, which is an important part of POCUS. The old days, it was even more so learning from the ground up and practice before learning. Obviously, we're trying to formalize things to some extent, but I think it is still a tool that is amenable to a lot of learning on the job and learning by doing, just, done in a safe, appropriate way.
Such a great answer. I hope that those listening who are curious, will take a course like the one SPOCUS iScan course or other ones that are available. PAs are welcome in a lot of the courses in our area. I know Brandon and I are both in the Northeast, but there are a lot of courses in the CME setting as well that PAs are welcome to sign up for. I think local mentorship is really key, like you're saying, to get the feedback on clinical integration and feedback on your portfolio of images and your interpretation as well. So those are all key parts. But I think having a guideline like this to go by, is really outstanding. It's a great place to start. What are some future, directions? Like, what do you see? You're such a visionary, Brandon. You really, have a lot of foresight on this. What do you see, the next guideline in 5 or 10 years, needing to account for? What are some areas that are still, gaps that we need to fill?
Well, as I said, the kind of more specialty or specialized settings can say things that are stronger than we can. So if you're a critical care society or cardiology society, you can say things that are more targeted to that setting. And it would be nice if those groups would kind of incorporate some of these general concepts so that we're all saying the same general thing, even if it's more targeted in some settings. But I also think that it may be hard to say anything that applies to everyone, that is all at one standard of strength. It may make sense to say these are the ideal practices that will probably be best. But this is a minimal standard, and if you can't do these certain things, then you actually probably shouldn't do POCUS. And I mean, there is a certain floor there, right? If you do things at a certain degree of unsafety, then it's better to not do it at all. And we tried to steer clear of that as much as possible, because we generally think it's better to have this tool than to not have it. But there is a degree of doing it wrong that you probably ought not to. So having that kind of spectrum may be the most helpful way to go about this. Shoot for this, but make sure you're at least doing certain things.
Awesome. Brandon, we're so lucky that you chose to publish your work with us. We're so lucky that you took the time out of your busy day to, record this podcast to tell us about you and about the work that you've been doing. Again, the article, Best Practices for Point of Care Ultrasound and Interdisciplinary Expert Consensus, that could be found at www.pocusjournal.com. It's the April 2024 issue, Volume 9, Issue 1. It starts on page 95. For those listening who are new to us, we are the I would say the world's leading POCUS journal based on our effort to keep the journal free for authors and free for readers. We're indexed on PubMed and peer reviewed, and we are published in November and April every year. And I think that's the time we have today. Brandon, if you have any closing remarks, thank you again for your insight and for your time.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. And we really love to put our piece in Focus Journal because it was perfectly suited to a kind of non specialty based statement that applied to everyone who does Focus. We really didn't want to put it somewhere where it was only for one particular audience. But I hope people are able to check it out and apply it kind of to whatever degree they find useful. And yeah, that's what we got. I'm if you guys want to reach out to me, I'm on Twitter at Crit Concepts. If you're interested in my own podcast, which is educational stuff, it's at Critical Care Scenarios. If you want to search for that, I'm happy to chat with anyone about any of these topics.
Awesome. We'll be sure to tag you with the link to the podcast as well on the X. Brandon, thanks again. Have a great day, everyone.